Right, welcome back. We're going to resume with two presentations. So our first panelist this afternoon is Dr. Sheryllynne Haggerty. She's an honorary research fellow at the Wilberforce Institute. Her expertise is in trading communities and the way in which they worked together in challenging times. Complementing this is an interest in networks of people, credit and goods, and the lives of men and women who facilitated this trade. Sheryllynne works in an interdisciplinary manner, both adopting socio-economic theory in her own work and by working with computer scientists, geographers, and economists. She is also an advocate for social network analysis and visual analytics, and she's presently working on an IFA funding project on the 18th century Jamaica.
That's the paper today. We're going to stand up. We've made a pact. We're going to do our best to keep you awake after lunch. Thank you very much. And this paper comes from...
That's not the... That's the other one.
That's the other one, sorry.
Make a talk on that.
Yeah, we talk on that, yeah. Good joke, you know, thank you very much. So you've already tried to entertain you. So yeah, so this paper comes from my book project, which I'm hoping is going to come out next year. I'm just editing at the moment. And so what today I'm going to give you a sort of overview of the book rather than any sort of detailed analysis per se. Okay, so let's see if I can work this. Thank you. So, in October 1756, Ewbank Ogle was in Kingston writing home to his mother in London. He and a family member, Brother Cuthbert, had recently arrived in Jamaica, no doubt hoping to make their fortune. However, Cuthbert had already fallen ill and was recovering in Port Royal. Not that that was any healthier, really, but there he was. And Ewbank wrote to surprise his mother with a career trajectory that was clearly not his initial intention. However, he wrote that he was determined to make the best of his opportunity to be a carpenter, and he hoped it would, quote, turn out very much to his advantage. At around the same time, Anne Graham, married and with a young daughter also living in Kingston, was also writing home to her mother in England. Her letter is full of mundane, everyday details. Complaints about the postal system, her husband being busy at work, family health, her child not wanting to go to school, a cousin's new child, and a friend who had recently died. Ewbank and Anne may have been living in Britain's richest colony, but like many other ordinary people in Jamaica at this time, they were simply trying to get on with their lives, care for their family, and make a living, despite the onset of the 7 Years' War. Yet Jamaica's historiography remains dominated by men such as the Beckfords, the Longs, other elite white planters such as Charles Price, the Lascelles and Simon Taylor, as well as successful merchants such as the Bright Mailers and the Hibbets. These forward-thinking entrepreneurial men were part of a modern capitalist plantation machine, and much of this trade, the trade in sugar and enslaved people, went through the island's principal port of Kingston, an urban space which competed for primacy with the capital Spanish town. Indeed, the history of Kingston and of Jamaica has been dominated by its economy and particularly the sugar plantations. Relatively little has been written about ordinary people's and particularly women's lives on economic roles in Jamaica, especially in urban areas. Ewbank and Anne were, of course, also part of this machine, but they were not elite, they were not rich, and most obviously, of course, Anne was not male. Ewbank and Anne's mundane stories therefore jar with what we think we know about mid-18th century Jamaica. Indeed, whilst we have insights into the mentalities of men such as Edward Long, William Beckford, and most recently James Knight, slavery, of course, also shaped the experiences and the lives and thoughts of ordinary people such as Ewbank and Anne, even if they took it for granted and did not mention it very much in their letters. And this is a little bit with Anne Claire's. It's the silence from this morning. So yet, whilst Jamaica's economy might have been modern and capitalistic, in which every free person benefited from the system of slavery, not all did so equally. As Bernard and all have recently shown, Jamaica was a really expensive place to live and was, quote, marked by an extraordinary degree of income inequality even within the free population. This was especially true of the transient white population of sailors and soldiers, as well as ordinary whites living in town, such as Eubank and Anne. So Jamaican society, I argue more widely in the book, was fractured by more than race. Oh, no, So say this comes from a wider book project, and that's just to give you an idea of the sort of overall chapters. But today I'm just going to talk to you about the 4 substantive chapters in italics: making money, war and politics, love, family and friendship, death, disease and decay. And the project is based on a cache of letters at the High Court and the prize papers in the High Court of Admiralty at TNA, and it's a micro history of Jamaica in this 1 year through the letters. So there's about 407 and other documents of them. And 1756 is quite an important time, whether it's as important as the French Revolution. It's just before the elite in Jamaica become really confident at the end of the 7 Years' War. They've got 30 years before the American, of real strong strength, especially in relation to Britain back at home. But it's also a few years before Taki's revolt hardened race relations, particularly in Jamaica. So today, as I say, it's a little snapshot of some of these vignettes of the main arguments. As I've alluded to, the letters are mostly from white people. They're about white people, but also thinking to Trevor's comments yesterday, we also don't know much about these ordinary people. So these letters are a real treasure trove, and they only survived because there was a war, and there was a ship that was taken by the French, and when it was retaken by the English as a prize, everything as normal was collected from the vessel until ownership was established, and the letters were taken, and they're still there. And they're the only major corpus for the whole of the 7 Years' War from Jamaica, these letters. Okay. So, but keep doing that. So lots of people supported Jamaica's slave society, including, as we have seen, Eubank Ogle. Just for this part of the presentation, I'm going to concentrate on women, particularly thinking about Christine Walker and the idea of that, women are the handmaidens of empire, and also just because we don't often have evidence from women, so I thought I'll put them there today. So Anne Morley, his letter is here, is one of the few women who wrote one of the letters found in the Europa's post bag. She was the widow of merchant Daniel Morley, who had died in 1751, and she'd been carrying on the business since then, dealing with London merchants directly, importing, gendered goods such as textiles, shoes, gloves and tea, but she also used bills of exchange and was well intertwined in Jamaica's international credit networks. Nathaniel Lloyd, formerly a minor merchant of Kingston, but now living in England, clearly thought Anne was a capable woman. He had given her charge and care of, to rent out his house in Duke Street, which she was renting out for him, and she reported that, quote, it was untenable from the bad condition it is in. Indeed, when the last tenant left, she reported, they'd simply left the key under the door. It seemed that there was more than one property, however, that she was renting out on his behalf, because she reported that Mrs. Atkins was leaving in October and asked for him to release her from paying onward the rent from these 2 properties. And by way of demonstrating that it was, that she was capable and it was the wider economy and defending her reputation, Anne added that many other houses in Kingston were empty. And I'll come to this in the next little section. There's a huge internal political war going on at the time, and actually the capital's just been moved from Kingston back to Spanish Town. And that will make more sense in the next bit. Okay. So although many women clearly made a good living from a variety of means, such as renting out property, as I've hinted at in rooms, renting out enslaved people, run shops and being seamstresses, and in fact many of the probate inventories, more widely including for 1756, show that many women died actually quite poor. And if they died in England with the same level of relative lack of wealth, they wouldn't have even had to produce a probate inventory for them, just peculiarities of Jamaican law. And so we find, for example, Sarah Jones, who was a widow with 3 small children. The youngest had been born since the family had arrived in 1753, and she was pregnant with a 4th child. Her husband, who had died in late 1755, has set himself up in business as a retailer on arrival in Jamaica, having brought a small cargo with him. His creditors were now pressing her for payment, but he had left several bad debts that could not be collected. So she petitioned the Jamaican House of Assembly, and this was read to the Assembly on the 28th of January 1756, and she wrote that she was, quote, reduced to the lowest extremity, occasioned by insolvent creditors, bad debts and other misfortunes in trade. She added, however, a moral element to her case, stating that her family had never applied for, quote, any assistance from the public funds, referring to the weekly allowance that new settlers were often granted under a law of 1749. It's probable, and thanks again to Trevor for sharing his databases, that her deceased husband was a William Jones, a huckster with £68 of his personal estate at 183 listed as bad debts. Now, Sarah's petition was referred to the Committee for Poor White Families for consideration. But I think the fact that a committee was required is telling in itself and highlights the income inequalities of Jamaica at this time. But elsewhere in her petition, she posited her family as a productive element in Jamaican society rather than troublesome and idle. And stressing her motherhood, she also highlighted the fact that, as Brooke Newman pointed out, that she completed a white woman's most crucial task. Indeed, this worked to her advantage. On 30th January, just 2 days after her petition was read, Sarah was awarded £150 for the relief of herself and her children. So this is just a little vignette to show that, you know, not everyone was wealthy, but women were active and knew how to play to the politics, I guess, of the time. So William Miller, back to what war and politics, William Miller was a captain of a slave trade vessel called the Black Prince, and he had encountered several problems selling his Cuban cargo, which I deal with in Making Money, the previous chapter a bit more widely, which he had attributed at least to the political rift between the merchants and the planters in Jamaica. So this rift had been going on for several years, and what it was a big argument. It was about power politics, both between the Kingston merchants and the Spanish town planters, about who should have control within Jamaica, but also there's a big power play between, you know, Jamaican elite and the border trade and the government at home. And in the middle of 1756, the court and all its records, its government and the governor moved to Kingston, very briefly, okay? But the whole of the Journals House Assembly for this year are full of this infighting between the two factions. So most of the literature on the 7 Years' War, except in perhaps Richard Pear's, concentrates on the war in Europe, especially in the war's early years. However, William Miller's letter home to his brother shows just how real and present the war was in the Caribbean right from the start, and how sort of ordinary people might have experienced it. So I should say, so he's a merchant captain, right? Not part of the Royal Navy. So his letter highlights the problems of the French privateers, which played havoc with Caribbean trade, the danger to life in ships being taken, 2 people being taken by those privateers, the letters of marque, which vessels needed to be able to take profit from those prizes. And he even commented on military strategy, noting, for example, that HMS Humber was moored safely at the Kingston Harbour. And he also alluded to many of the other Royal Navy ships being at Port Royal. He also alludes to the party prejudice between the planters and the merchants. And this political friction highlights the disparities in the experiences of the war between the rich and the poor in Jamaica. Whilst the elite were concentrated on power struggles both between themselves and the metropole, ordinary people like William Miller found their trade disrupted over and above the problems caused by war, such as privateers and high prices. At the same time, it's worth noting that a few people could take advantage of this, even in a risky way. So these very threats provided opportunities for ordinary seamen to make money from their share of such prizes, So not on Miller's vessel, but on another one in early October, Edward Magna, who had jumped off a slave trade vessel, wrote home to say that he had joined another vessel, a privateer, and he boasted that, quote, "We have taken some prizes and expect to share £50 a man and hope to sail for England before Christmas." This is about sort of like almost an annual wage of an artisan back in England. But it's still risky. At the same time, for the poorest and for many of the sailors and soldiers posted to Jamaica, the consequences of the political dispute and of the war more widely were, as Pears noted, literally a matter of life and death. One guy, William Ford, wrote home, who was on a Royal Navy vessel, "I have no news to let you know, but bad the yellow fever has been all through our ship, which one half of our people that came out from England are dead." Indeed, even normal living conditions for troops were always poor. We know that the death rates there, particularly for serving forces, were really bad. But this was made worse in 1756 by the political infighting. Governor Knowles noted even as early as February that he had experienced much difficulty getting any money for the island's fortifications, quote, "such were the heats and animosity in the House of Assembly." And in October, the Assembly heard a report about the barracks in Spanish Town, both of which needed lots of repairs and which were to be expedited. Just as an aside, the committee also reported that a new room for confining disorderly men was to be made of 20 feet by 30 feet. It was to have platforms in it with air holes all around, a strong door and no windows. One wonders if they got the irony that it sounds very like the description of a slave ship. So love, family and friendship. So this is love, family and friendship. The dominant historiography of Jamaica is that it has hyper-masculine space. Not many families, certainly there weren't many families that were successful. But actually in the letters we do see that quite a few merchants, for example in Kingston, were living there with their wives and sometimes with the children as well. And this included one lesser merchant, John Crow, who'd been there only a couple of years, but he was ready to go home and, as he put it, hand over to the next generation, as he was, quote, "not likely to increase my family," in brackets, I hope. He was living with his wife, Anne, in Kingston, and at some point their daughter Elizabeth had been with them, but she was sent home to England, presumably for education, it doesn't say, by 1762, when he wrote his will. John Crow must have actually loved his wife, as he left her very well cared for in his will of 1762, and this is sort of a bit in contrast to your parsimonious husbands. He left her £12,000 sterling to be paid within 1 month of his decease, without any clause against her remarrying, and was also bequeathed all of his enslaved people and all the linen, china, household furniture, horses and carriages, in addition to some annuities. As we saw also, Anne Graham was living in Kingston with a husband, a daughter, and also as a sister living on the island, I'm not sure with her or not. And her letter strikes quite a modern tone. Anne told her mother that her sister had grown quite thin, but that she herself was growing so fat, "I cannot tell what to do with myself." Anne clearly doted on her little girl. She had been going to school for some time, but Anne wrote home to her mother that, quote, "the little soul does not like it very much, for she always makes a bargain with me that she must not go to school." Anne told her mother that she hoped to send her daughter to school in England the next year under her mother's care, but added that when she did, her mother would have, quote, "my very heart and soul," and hoped that she would prize her as such. Anne clearly indulged her daughter as well. She wrote, "I am such a fond hen of my one chicken that I cannot bear to see her uneasy." I think Anne realised that she was perhaps being a little overprotected. She ended her musings on her daughter thus, quote, "I do not think I shall have another one," so maybe she's hoping, along with John Crow, to have another, and so must make the most of my little prize. But I believe you must be almost tired of my nonsense about my brat. Even if loving children, people had their loving children with them in Jamaica, it's not likely to be a personal arrangement, and Anne Graham's little chicken had to make the most of her loving hen while she could. Cheery death, disease and decay, not my most cheery chapter in the book. You will be glad to know there are no hookworms. And as I was thinking, had I seen any hookworm? I don't know. I haven't even mentioned it. But of course, they're not writing about being enslaved, who are more likely to have it. So, okay. So I'm sorry to keep referring to you, Trevor, but Trevor's written about Jamaica's gallows humour as a way in which people cope with the, increasing the high mortality and morbidity around it. And I've got plenty of examples of that in the letter. Billy Lamb is dead, literally warranted only these 4 words at the end of a postscript of one merchant's letter. He is actually mentioned by a few other letters, including one by Little Brown and Holland, who will mention him, but only by way of noting that they were, quote, in some fears about his bills of exchange. And on the whole, these merchants do appear more concerned with the financial ramification of Billy Lamb's death than his actual demise. Indeed, the way in which Billy Lamb died epitomises the precariousness of life in Jamaica. He died when his curing house collapsed on him during one of the late half squalls of wind. And I've just put these lovely, if anyone's seen Brube's Garden by Brown. He uses these little satirical sketches of Johnny Newcombe about the high death rates in there. I just put them up there because we're going to have a look at them. I think they're probably online at John Carter Brown Library as well. However, not everyone was made cynical in Jamaica by their experiences. George Harding wrote home to his wife and was feeling quite reflective about his life on the island. Of his hopes and fears he wrote, quote, "Before my eyes passed his visions, the grossest iniquities in the broad daylight which passed unnoticed and uncensured." It is not clear whether he was referring to the political war between the planters and the merchants, the slavery surrounded him, or perhaps his economic prospect as a lawyer. It may have been the latter, as he noted of his hateful employment of, quote, "unravelling frauds and iniquities of my fellow creatures. God amend their hearts, but for 2 or 3 families where outward order and decency is reserved, I should almost forget to speak. Whatever it was he feared, he mused, no wonder my soul sickens at the seeing. Oh, what a bubble is this life that one should be for one moment fond of it." In an even worse mental state was William Brown. He wrote in May to Mary Rose, who was Rose Fuller's former lover, so who's an elite planter who'd returned to England at the end of 1755, and she's in Spanish Town. And William Brown had been sent to Jamaica on behalf of Fuller to go and work on one of his plantations, I think, but clearly he was very unhappy and was metaphorically begging on his knees in floods of tears to go home to England. And I think he wrote to Mary Rose in the hope that she would intercede on his behalf with Fuller's agents and attorneys in Spanish Town, Mr. Lee, and other people in fact write to Mary in order to try and get her to work on their behalf. It's not always successful. Yeah, and he said that she had previously been very kind to him. Now, it's unclear whether his depression was due to conditions in society in Jamaica that disturbed him or whether he was simply desperately homesick, but he continued that he was, quote, "deprived of all my reasons, my brain so disordered that I shall and am incapable of any business. Please," he begged Mary, "if you would help, you would preserve a soul from utter ruin." He even offered to pay his own passage home. Surely, he implored, if Mr. Fuller knew about the true state of his condition, he would let him return. So William was clearly badly affected by his sojourn to Jamaica, but whether Mary was in a position to help him with Rose Fuller then in England is another matter. I don't actually know how that story ends, as with many of my stories. So as Brown notes, quote, "We know little about the meaning of mortality, the meaning of mortality motivated people to act. But whilst the ever-presence of death may have been accentuated, White's penchant for fast living, heightening their fatalism and encouraging a callous disregard for the welfare of their enslaved, at least some felt truly bereft at the death of their loved ones." It's difficult to say how representative these letters are because we don't have very many. But as far as I can tell, they are representative of other similar letters being written from a distant home at this time. They fill a particular format, and even the very poorest of sailors know how to write a good letter. They know the format of it as well. But although, yes, the landscape is dominated by sugar and the economy is, about 2/3 of settlements are actually non-sugar estates, And we don't know much about all the whites living in urban areas either, so difficult to say. But what they do provide is a view onto a different mentality rather than the elite about who we know the most. And I think it's quite clear that not everyone signed up to the dominant mores of Jamaican society, sort of calculating commercialism, gallows humour, and sort of live fast and die young. It's very clear also that wealth was unequally distributed even amongst the white population. And I think that idea there's a community for more poor people, I didn't know about that before I did this, so I think that's quite telling in itself. And it's quite ordinary people even experience the war. So we know about the sailors and the soldiers, we know that they died. But you've even got loads of merchants writing home and sort of saying, what's on with the elite? What's going on? Don't they know the French are just there? Like, what are they all fighting about this for? And what's more, it's, you know, it's interfering with business as well. It's just bad. There's also, I know that, you know, lots of families didn't last very long. In fact, John Crow just, you know, died 6 years after these letters were written, etc. But there were some loving families living there. It sort of goes against the grain of most of what we know. Even if they were short-lived, the children were going to go back home. In terms of death and disease, some people did seem genuinely really disconcerted and dismayed about the death and destruction all around them. But then at the same time said, most people don't even mention Anne Graham surely must have had a, you know, an enslaved servant helping her. She doesn't mention them at all. So I think these letters help to show that in 1756 Jamaica was a fractured society, but not only among racial lines.
Very much for this stimulating presentation. If you don't mind, we'll have you speaking more and we'll ask questions after your presentation. I'm going to present you now to our second panelist is Anne-Claire Faucquez. She's an associate professor in American Civilization and History at Université Paris 8. She recently published in 2021, a book entitled From New Netherland to New York, The Birth of a Slavery Society, 1624-1712. She works on New York's colonial past and more specifically on the issues of class and race in colonial America by comparing dependent populations of forced laborers, slaves, indentured servants, apprentices, and soldiers. The next project deals with history writing and the erasure of the history of slavery in the 19th century, history books and textbooks. She is also interested in the commemoration and representation of slavery in public spaces, in the public space, museums, monuments, and contemporary art.
Thank you very much, Mélanie. Right, stand as well, all that. So, this, as Mélanie said, this is a presentation of a brand new project, so I will be welcoming any of your remarks and reactions. All right, so the discovery of the African burial ground I was mentioning this morning in Lower Manhattan in 1991, which was called the largest archaeological finding in North America, left the city in total awe. This 18th century cemetery housing more than 15,000 bodies of enslaved Africans and free blacks had been completely buried underground and forgotten by all. If slavery now begins to be recognized and reintegrated into the historical narrative of the young colony and state of New York, we would like now to understand why it has been erased. Why was everyone so surprised about the existence of this burial ground? Why had everyone in the 1990s forgotten about the presence of enslaved Africans in colonial New York? What happened between the early years of abolitionism and the late 20th century? So this was the type of questions I'm asking myself. So as Claire showed us yesterday, while free blacks were trying hard to be recognized as respectable citizens, white Northerners engaged in a process of erasing the traces of slavery in the North. So this is the reason why I would like to inquire about the 19th century, trying to figure out why the memory of slavery has disappeared between the passing of the first abolition law, so the gradual emancipation law in 1799, and then the final abolition in 1827, and the end of the 19th century. How has the memory of slavery been shaped and transformed to the point of being totally erased in Northerners' minds and collective memory? So I will start this presentation by looking at the physical erasure of slavery and Black presence in early 19th century New York by looking at the example of the burial ground. Then in a second part, and this is the very beginning of my project, I will delve into early history books and textbooks to witness the erasure and rewriting of that history of slavery. Before trying to understand, and this will be on my third part, these are questions, trying to understand how the myth of the free North has been fashioned and has replaced this history of slavery. So the first enslaved Africans were introduced in New Amsterdam in 1626. They had been imported by the Dutch West India Company. And by 1664, a small community of free Blacks had actually settled in the northern parts of Manhattan Island. So what you can see here, is there a pointer? Yeah. So what you can see here is New Amsterdam. So if you know a little bit of New York, this is Wall Street. So New Amsterdam was really the tip of the southern tip of the island. So the African burial ground was situated here around this pond, and free Blacks had been given pieces of land, tracts of land by the Dutch West India Company in the northern part of the pond and of the African burial ground. So these men and women had successfully petitioned for their own freedom and had been granted their freedom by the company, as well as parcels of land by the Council of New Amsterdam, under the condition that a portion of their farming proceeds go to the company. In reality, these parcels of land served as a buffer zone between the European settlements in the closely guarded and defended southern tip of Manhattan and Native Americans who might conduct raids and attacks from the north. The African burial ground, which is supposed to have been first in use at the beginning of the 18th century or very end of the 17th century, was positioned next to the free Blacks' farming estates. Indeed, the situation was both far enough from New Amsterdam, New York, for the white population to not be bothered by its presence and close to the free Black community. As the city grew and progressively extended northward, the physical traces of the presence of Black people began to be concealed and erased. When the English captured the Dutch colony and renamed it New York in 1664, free Blacks were demoted from property owners to legal aliens, being denied land-owning rights and privileges. African land ownership was then effectively ended by the severe Black codes that were passed after the first slave revolt in mainland America, the New York slave revolt of 1712, which included a ban on inheritance of property. Within 20 years, a vast majority of land owned by people of African descent was seized by wealthy white landowners. So here, just to share a little something about the map. So here is a map of New York, contemporary New York. So the African burial ground was really found in downtown New York, next to City Hall. This is City Hall. This is Broadway, so you know, really downtown. And here, the black rectangle represents the the parts of the burial ground which has been excavated, and so 419 skeletons were excavated, and there's now a memorial and a small visitor center. But the actual African burial ground covers this whole gray area. So which means when you walk downtown in New York today, you still walk on skeletons, basically. Okay, so this represents the whole, the 15,000 bodies that were buried there. So in her book, The African Burial Ground in New York City, Memory, Spirituality and Space, Andrea E. Frone explains that the African burial ground began to fall into disuse in the 1790s as the city expanded northward, an expansion that accelerated after the opening of the Erie Canal in 1819. The cemetery was covered to level the ground and facilitate the construction of new homes. Quote, from the 1790s to the 1810s, between 16 and 25 feet of fill was placed over the graves to level this hilly part of Manhattan. The African burial ground was largely in a ravine and had to be backfilled to reach the grave. She even adds that some of the graves were unfortunately damaged because the land was built before the leveling, and tragically the construction of, quote, a privy shaft or early toilet resulted in the destruction of half of every skeleton buried there. So that narrative of physically covering the presence of African Americans, of Black New Yorkers in the city, is indeed very symbolical, very representative of the erasure it experienced all along the 19th century. So I'm going to give you another example of erasure. Before Central Park was created, so this is the story of Seneca Village, I don't know if you've heard about it. Before Central Park was created, the landscape along what is now the park's perimeter from West 82nd Street to West 89th Street was the site of a community called Seneca Village, a community of predominantly African Americans, many of whom were property owners. By 1855, the village consisted of approximately 225 residents, made up of roughly 2/3 African Americans, 1/3 Irish immigrants, and a small number of individuals of German descent. Seneca Village began in 1825, when landowners in the area, John and Elizabeth Whitehead, sorry, wrong people, subdivided their land and sold it as 200 lots. By the early 1830s, there were approximately 10 homes in the village. There is some evidence that residents had gardens and raised livestock in Seneca Village, and the nearby Hudson River was a likely source of fishing for the community. A nearby spring known as Tamas Spring provided a water source. By the mid-1850s, Seneca Village comprised 50 homes, 3 churches, burial grounds, as well as a school for African American students. For African Americans, Seneca Village offered the opportunity to live in an autonomous community far from the densely populated downtown. Despite New York State's abolition of slavery in 1827, discrimination was still prevalent toward the city and severely limited the lives of African Americans. Seneca Village's remote location likely provided a refuge from this climate. Compared to other African Americans living in New York, residents of Seneca Village seem to have been more stable and prosperous. By 1855, approximately half of them owned their own houses. Of the 100 Black New Yorkers eligible to vote in 1845, 10 lived in the village. The fact that many residents were property owners contradicts some common misperceptions during the mid-19th century that the people living on the land slated for the park were poor squatters living in shanties. While some residents lived in shanties and in crowded conditions, most lived in two-story homes. Census records show that African Americans were employed as laborers and in service jobs. Records also show that most children who lived in Seneca Village attended school. Yet, during the early 1850s, the city began planning for a large municipal park to counter unhealthful urban conditions and provide space for recreation. In 1853, the New York State Legislature enacted a law that set aside 775 acres of land in Manhattan between 5th and 8th Avenues to create the country's first major landscaped public park. The city acquired the land through eminent domain, the law that allows the government to take private land for public use with compensation paid to the landowner. There were roughly 1,600 inhabitants displaced throughout the whole area. Although landowners were compensated, many argued that their land was undervalued. Ultimately, all residents had to leave by the end of 1857. Research is underway to determine where Seneca Village residents relocated. Some may have gone to other African American communities in the region, such as Sandy Ground in Staten Island and Skunk Hollow in New Jersey. So if African Americans were progressively displaced and replaced by other communities or other projects in the city, their very existence was also erased in history books. And I took these two examples of physical erasure because I think they're very representative of what happened in history books. So 19th century history books and history textbooks published before the Civil War tend to eradicate the history of African Americans, either by rewriting it, eluding it, or stereotyping it. When the words slave, Negroes, or Africans are mentioned in these early books from the beginning of the 19th century, it is either to talk about taxes. The word Negro is often associated with the word tax because the tax imposed on enslaved people is just another tax on goods. So enslaved people are just another type of goods. So that's one instance. The second instance is to talk about the 1741 Negro plots. This is very interesting because there was another real revolt in 1712. The 1712 slave revolt is hardly ever mentioned, whereas this revolt actually took place with 9 white people being killed in 1712, whereas the 1741 plot was just a plot, a conspiracy based on rumors, and no one was actually killed. There is no evidence of having black people plotting it or actually assaulting or killing white people. So I don't know if you know about that event. So in 1741, a couple of fires occurred at regular intervals, daily, weekly, 1 month throughout the city. And rumors started to spread after a witness claimed to have seen a black man running away from one of the scenes of the fires. So this is how it all started, and people went crazy and decided that black people were plotting to overthrow slavery and kill white New Yorkers. So as a result of the trials, where false confessions were made, of course, 200 black people had been arrested. 18 black people were hanged, 13 were burned to death. More than 70 blacks and 7 whites were banished from England's North American colonies. So the 1741 plots became widely known in history and in the writing of history thanks to the publication made by Daniel Hoosmanden. He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in the province of New York, and he was one of the judges, of course, of the trial. So he published this journal of the proceedings in the detection of the conspiracy formed by some white people in conjunction with Negro and other slaves for burning the city of New York in America and murdering the inhabitants. As a judge at the trials, the author's intention in writing this 400-page day-by-day account was to furnish the reader, I quote, with the most natural view of the whole and be better enabled to conceive the design and dangerous depth of this hellish project, as well as the justice of the several proceedings. So whether the plot actually happened or not has not yet been solved, but what is interesting to us is the impact of that story in the history writing of slavery. Hoosmanden's account can be considered as the first history of slavery in New York. And let me show you some examples. So William Smith Sr., one of the prosecutors of the trials, wrote that the plot was evidence of, quote, the monstrous ingratitude of this black tribe, and that it, quote, exceedingly aggravates their guilt. Indeed, quote, their slavery among us is generally softened with great indulgence. They live without care and are commonly better fed and clothed and put to less harbor than the poor of most Christian countries. They are indeed slaves, but under the protection of the laws, none can hurt them with impunity. They are really more happy in this place than in the midst of the continual plunder, cruelty, and rapine of their native countries. But notwithstanding all the kindness and tenderness with which they have been treated among us, yet this is the second attempt of the same kind that this brutish and bloody species of mankind have made within one age. So we have seen here that the first instance of the writing of the history of slavery in New York insists on the benevolence of the masters in order to better condemn enslaved people for having conspired and having offended and disrespected the white population. Have another quote similar here. You Negroes are treated here with great humanity and tenderness. You have no hard taskmasters. Ye are not laden with too heavy burdens, but your work is moderate and easy, and say your mistress no pros to you, she very good or she good enough. All right, so his narrative was greatly criticized at the time among some of New York's New York's most prominent political and intellectual figures, such as the Surveyor General of the colony, the member of the Governor's Council, or even William Smith Jr., who was a historian and the son of William Smith Sr., one of the prosecutors of the trials. And he said that saying that a few slaves would hope to effect a massacre of their masters, authors vindicate their liberties, was the height of absurdity. So he completely criticized his father's position, and he totally condemned this, the publishing of Hoosmanden's trials. Shortly after the trials, Hoosmanden's work was totally discredited, and he himself lamented that, I quote, the thing dies away and is almost forgotten. But what is interesting is that when you look at history books from the early 19th century, the only instance of a connection with slavery in the history of New York is through the 1741 plots. This episode is frequently recalled in almost all history books I looked at, and with always an accusatory tone on the role played by enslaved Africans. So let me pick up another example. So yeah, you have this one, for instance, from 1835. the history of the United States, or Uncle Philip's conversations with the children about New York. So this is a 2-volume book. The first volume starts with the discovery of New York with Henry Hudson in 1609, going to 1741. There is no mention of African people being in New York. Volume 2 starts with in 1741, so starts with the plot, and this is the only instance I found. I'm about to talk about the Negro plot, as it is called. What do you mean by that, Uncle Philip? I mean a conspiracy formed by the Negroes of New York to set fire to the city, murder their masters, and make themselves free. I thought there were no slaves in New York, sir. They are known now, but formerly there were slaves in this state. Okay, so this little, very brief mentioning, 1835, slavery was officially abolished in 1827, but if you look at the record, there were still enslaved people in rural areas, in Brooklyn, in all around, not in the city, but in the other counties. Okay. Another example, Barber John Warner, Historical Collections of the State of New York, containing a general collection of the most interesting facts, traditions, biographical sketches, anecdotes, etc., published in 1841. So this is the part where you have one mention of African people. The young folks would crowd around the hearth, listening with breathless attention to some old crone of a Negro who was the oracle of the family and who, perched like a raven in a corner of the chimney, would croak forth for a long winter afternoon a string of incredible stories about New England witches, grisly ghosts, horses without heads, and hairbreadth escapes and bloody encounters among the Indians. So what is interesting here is that we have the traditional image of the African person being the entertainer, the storyteller, the superstitious person as well. So this is a traditional stereotype that we commonly see, and that unfortunately we still see today. You see that example from 1841. Another example here from the book by Anne McVicker Grant, Memoirs of an American Lady, a Scottish lady, Mélanie, I don't know if you know her. So she was born in Scotland and she followed her father, who was a member of the 77th Regiment of Foot, which was the first Scottish regiment to fight in the 7 Years' War. So she came with her father to North America, and she lived mostly in Albany, so in the north of the colony of New York. She was a close friend of the Schuler family, who were prominent Dutch family, slave-owning family. And this is what she says: in the society I'm describing, even the dark aspect of slavery was softened by a smile. I have nowhere met with instances of friendship more tender and generous than that which here subsisted between the slaves and the masters and mistresses. One more example. So in 1846, this book by John Watson, Annals and Occurrences of New York City and State in the Olden Time. So John Watson was one of the leading historians of local history in the United States, writing a history of New York City as well as a history of the city of Philadelphia in 1830. Based on the oral histories of residents. So he interviewed people and he collected their testimonies. So this so-called authentic history shows the, maybe we can call that the disinterest of the residents for the presence of African people in the city, or their total forgiveness about an institution which had been abolished 20 years before. And can also show us that the situation in a segregated place that New York was in 1846. So he says, then slavery was of the mildest form. Their slaves were really happy. They seemed like Abraham's servants who were all born in the house. Nothing pained them so much as the fear to be sent away or to be sold for bad conduct to the West Indies. Jamaica. The blacks were indulged in a great freedom of speech, in giving their opinion and advice. It was indeed wonderful to see so little of servility and fear on the one side, and so little harshness or authority on the other. They were the most devoted and affectionate and honest servants imaginable. All right. It was only part of the quotation. All right, sorry. So one last example out of my period, out of the 19th century, but when I started working on the history of slavery in New York, I read the whole historiography, and I was struck that even in the 1960s, historians could still write things, could still propagate this myth, okay, of a more tolerant type of slavery in the North, and especially due to the Dutch presence. So when historians turn their attention to social history and African American history, the narrative of slavery in the North remained tinged with paternalistic stereotypes. Edgar McManus, author of A History of Negro Slavery in 1966, emphasized the benevolence of the Dutch, who were more interested in trade than in establishing a racial society. The system was as mild as the realities of chattel slavery probably allowed. There was none of the mutual hatred in New Netherland of the sort that brutalized slave relations in other colonies. The pragmatic Dutch regarded slavery as an economic expedient. They never equated it with social organization or racial control. So this is something historians keep fighting against, this idea that Dutch people were more tolerant towards their enslaved population. So why and how has this history been rewritten? Which discourses have supplanted it? So if Southerners rewrote the history of slavery, I'm sure you know this, by shaping the myth of the lost cause, especially after the Civil War, my point is to say that Northerners also fashioned their own myth. They also participated in the shaping of history, and by fashioning another myth, the myth of the free North, they sought to emphasize their moral superiority over the Southern states because they were the first to have abolished slavery and thus stood up for freedom. Whether in slave narratives or abolitionist tracts, slavery is presented as totally absent in the northern states and its practice confined, associated with the South. This is a southern practice. We never had slaves, basically. So I just looked at a couple of slave narratives, especially ones that take place in New York. So this slave narrative by Solomon Northup, 12 Years a Slave. Narrative of Solomon Northup, a citizen of New York, kidnapped in Washington City in 1841 and rescued in 1853, published in 1853. So it depicts antebellum New York as a free place where blacks were endangered by slave hunters who tracked them down to be sent as enslaved people to the South. References to northern freedom abound here. Let me read. In many northern minds, perhaps the idea of a man holding his brother man in servitude and the traffic in human flesh may seem altogether incompatible with their conceptions of a moral or religious life. Or having all my life breathed the free air of the North, I could only gaze wistfully towards the North and think of the thousands of miles that stretched between me and the soil of freedom, so connection between the North and the soil of freedom, over which a black freeman may not pass. And even when Solomon is describing his kidnapping, he presents it as something exceptional. Slavery was indeed something that happened in a distant land, could not happen in the North. It was an exceptional thing. Then did the idea begin to break up in my mind, at first dim and confused, that I had been kidnapped. But that I thought was incredible. There must have been some misapprehension, some unfortunate mistake. It could not be that a free citizen of New York who had wronged no man nor violated any law should be dealt with thus inhumanly. So slave narratives served an ideological purpose, namely to elicit the sympathy of Northern readers to the plight of Southern slaves, as well as to publicize the abolitionist movement. Specific characteristics made the genre very successful and attractive to 19th century readers. So you have this kind of vertical movement, geographical movement from the south to the north, symbolizing the revival from the pits of hell to the Garden of Eden, the upward elevation from the debased state of subservience to the status of the free man, the progress from the subhuman animal-like condition to humanity, as well as the transition from childhood to manhood. So the North is really the representation of all these moral conditions. Another instance in which the history of the North has been associated in people's minds with that of freedom is through the story of the Underground Railroad. This story, while historically grounded, of course, in which Harriet Tubman has played a prominent role, was interestingly rewritten after the war. Romanticized that story has been romanticized by Northerners who transformed themselves into true heroes of freedom, sometimes exaggerating the number of fugitives, forgetting about the role of black people played in the escape, telling the story of a mysterious secret organization which made the pride of the family, the community, and the region. This is something that has been developed by Larry Garrah in The Legend of the Underground Railroad, published in 1861. And interestingly, as I said, that history, that legend of the Underground Railroad has been developed after the Civil War in 1872 by a book by William Sill, The Underground Railroad. And the Liberty Line, William Steele, this one, and Wilbur Siebert, published in 1898, based on former anti-slavery workers' testimonies. So we can imagine the great distortion in these people's memories. So what I try to piece together here is the fact that as northern states started to abolish slavery locally and engage in the national crusade against slavery, they started to fashion a new discourse of freedom, simultaneously erasing the historical traces of slavery in the North. So let me just talk a little bit about the commemoration of slavery in New York. So after the rediscovery of the African burial ground, the memory of slavery has resurfaced in New Yorkers' minds and memorial space with the opening of exhibitions like this one in 2005 in the New York Historical Society, the erection of many monuments and memorials like here the African burial ground memorial situated on the very sites of the burial ground in 2007. You have a monument here dedicated to the memory of Harriet Tubman in Holland. And you have the Arch of Return on the site of the United Nations that was erected in 2015. So if these projects are laudable and noteworthy, one has to remain cautious looking at the way memory is being staged and presented. The visit of the site of the African burial ground is now an integral part of a thematic guided tour of the city, the New York Underground Railroad and Slavery Tour, which aims at promoting the history of slavery in New York, but cannot help but emphasize the heroic side of abolitionists and New Yorkers. So let me read from their websites. Come and listen to tales of courage and triumph and discover the stories of real New Yorkers who risked their lives and properties to help people escape slavery. So I took the tour. I was really excited about, seeing what people could say about slavery in New York. And 3/4 of it were about abolitionism and how great New Yorkers were in taking part in. So you see, it's the underground and slavery tour. So the underground and the freedom part is still very present. So hence perpetuating this partisan sectionalist memory of the 19th century. Thank you.